In 2023, more than 39,000 adult men in the United States died by suicide. Research estimates that as much as 60% of those men may have sought help within a month before taking their own life. A lot has been made about the crisis in masculinity in recent years. Many of these conversations have been unhelpful. And just like so much in our fractured society, for every article, every TikTok, and every YouTube video out there about the problems facing boys and men, there's another, either questioning its validity or arguing whether or not it might just be the deserved outcome of a backlash against generations of oppressive patriarchy. This whirlwind of underinformed opinions, mixed with a sense of cultural absolutism and generational retribution, sometimes valid, has the collective sense of making the entire conversation feel like a zero-sum game, one where the crisis in masculinity and any ideas over what to do about it are foundationally at odds with women's liberation or feminism broadly. The result is that many men find themselves trapped in a void of confusion, despair, loneliness, and anger. And in a world governed by algorithms and short-form virality, the voices that rise to the top of the trash heap to fill that void are almost always the most confused, the most nihilistic, and the most angry to match. There is an army of quote-unquote men's rights influencers who make themselves easy targets. And for some of them, making themselves a target is actually a calculated, though cynical, marketing tactic. And so the backlash against them fuels the same seemingly endless cycle of anger that more closely resembles putting points on an arbitrary scoreboard, while any meaningful dialogue over addressing the root of the compound crises facing men in the 21st century gets drowned out in the cultural noise. No matter where you come down on the intricacies of gender politics, the numbers simply don't lie. In 2023, the last year we have the most complete data, more than 39,000 men committed suicide. Of all the suicides in the country in a given year, men make up 80% of them. Suicide is now the second leading cause of death among young men, and 1 in 4 young men nationwide report acute feelings of loneliness. In 2023, 42% of adult men were single, and for those in early adulthood, it's over half. And perhaps the most telling, only 56% of Americans are hopeful for the future of the United States. With younger Americans, it's even lower. A 2023 Wall Street Journal NORC survey found that nearly 80% of Americans do not expect life for their children's generation to be better than it has been for their own. For most of us, that is already shaking out to be true. All of these statistics have been trending in the wrong direction for years now. But if you clicked on this video, then you've probably heard some variation of these alarming statistics before. But what's more worrisome is the long-term trend that they point to, a crisis of meaning that is corroding the foundations of what it means to be a happy, healthy human in the 21st century. The crisis of meaning is not gendered, but it hits men and women in different ways. And if you have read any one of the last dozen or so New York Times bestsellers on the plight of young men and boys, then you know that while there is hope for girls and women that they'll pull ahead in the years to come, the outlook is much more bleak for men. And that's one of the reasons I've chosen to center this video around them specifically. The other reason is the obvious one. I'm a man myself. It's the one side of this argument that I actually do have the credentials to talk about. And the third reason is a practical one, because a country filled with angry, disaffected young men rarely thrives, especially if the compound crises putting their desperation in hyperdrive are allowed to fester. What's that old proverb? The child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. Well, sparks are starting to fly on the outskirts of the village, and I don't think you have to tune into the nightly news for too long to figure that out. Unless you were living under a rock during the last presidential election, you probably remember how much was made about the crises facing young men and the role their collective disillusionment played in electing Donald Trump. Or, more to the point, perhaps, how young men collectively abandoned the Democratic Party en masse, many in the direction of Trump, but many more in the direction of electoral nihilism. The Democratic Party subsequently realized that they don't know how to talk to men. Hot take, I know. So they've since hired armies of very expensive pollsters, influencers, and political consultants like me to try and make the modern post-Obama party more palatable to young men. But like nearly every other aspect of the conversation around the challenges facing men, this framing misses the point almost entirely because it focuses on treating the symptoms of male disenfranchisement without ever making it close to addressing the root cause. The crisis of our time is a crisis of meaning. It drives everything, from the homelessness crisis to the opioid crisis to the collapse of trust in public institutions and government. Nearly every major ill in our culture is downstream of that, the crisis in masculinity included. People look around at our chaotic world and innately see an even more chaotic future. They look around at the tragic mismanagement of government, a trend that started long before anyone in my generation was born, and they see no reason why they should believe that government will start caring about them anytime soon. I can't say I disagree there, and chances are good you don't either. People look around at how wealth, and more importantly, opportunity, is hoarded among the elite class and instinctively realize that no one with any real power cares about them or the unique challenges those in the working class face. Look no further than the recent Epstein file debacle. The mismanagement of one of the biggest and most depraved scandals in American history is astounding. And yet most of us are beginning to come to terms with what we all know will eventually be true. There will likely be little, if any, consequences for anyone involved. If you have to ask yourself why people in the 21st century are so disillusioned, there's your answer. We are at an inflection point in the human story. We can all feel it, even if we struggle to articulate it. The world is changing, and for many of us, especially men, it feels like an open question if the future will have any space or use for us at all. But these eras of mass societal change are cyclical, and we know, looking back at other similar periods, that the only hope for navigating times of uncertainty and chaos and making it to the other side means we have to adapt and change with the times, personally and in the collective. And so it is a necessity that we reframe what it means to be a human being, to live a happy and prosperous life. We have to rethink what it means to live the good life in the 21st century. This is the generational task of our time, and big picture, it isn't gendered. Both men and women have to grapple with it. But when it comes to men specifically, the data tells a grim story, and the trends are moving in the wrong direction. The model for what masculinity can and should be is broken, and it needs to be rebuilt. And how we do that matters. I am far from the first YouTube creator, faceless or otherwise, to go on a diatribe about the crisis facing men. And it's true, the president is a man, elected at least in part by a swing in the male electorate. Most Fortune 500 CEOs are men. Statistically speaking, your boss is probably a man. Many men seem to be doing just fine, so it's understandable to assume that the so-called crisis of masculinity is either exaggerated, imagined, or even fabricated entirely. But this is where those arguments always fall apart, because we aren't talking about the few men at the apex of elite power, the ones who are incentivized to keep the current system in place. We're talking about everyone else. Because ignoring this crisis doesn't make it go away, and mocking it doesn't make it harmless. Pretending that the handful of men at the top invalidates the suffering of millions below them is a convenient lie designed to obscure the true power structure of the political and economic elite. If we want humanity to survive and thrive into the future, we have to take this crisis seriously. As Douglas Gillette and Robert Moore wrote nearly 35 years ago, let us frankly admit the enormous difficulty of our situation, For it is only when we allow ourselves to see the seriousness of any problem and to admit what it is that we're up against that we can begin to take appropriate action, action that will be life-enhancing for us and others. So, what is that appropriate life-enhancing action? Because taking the crisis in masculinity seriously is an important first step, but it's not enough. A society where more and more men see little hope for the future is one that is doomed to end in chaos. Waving the crisis of masculinity off as reactionary grievance politics is just a way to avoid a much harder question. How do we rebuild a model of manhood that actually works for the future generations we're responsible for handing it off to? Societies don't function without men who are grounded, capable, and invested in the future. Children rarely thrive without parents who are present and accountable. Institutions don't endure when they're led by men who don't understand or value duty, restraint, or compassion. The old model of masculinity, of the emotionally flattened provider who inherits authority by default, is gone, and for good reason. But that means that it falls on us, on our generation, to rebuild a new model of masculinity that prepares future generations for a world we are racing towards, a world where the economy is perpetually in a state of unease, where global tensions are always on the rise, where jobs are always on the line and political collapse is always one election away. Our future is uncertain, so we have to be certain about ourselves. The future won't respond to brute force or inherited status. It'll reward adaptability, emotional regulation, competence, cooperation, moral clarity, and long-term generational thinking. In other words, we can't keep teaching boys how to thrive in a world that no longer exists. Right now, too much of our politics, our economy, and our culture behave as though men are optional, disposable, interchangeable, and we see the results in grim suicide stats, concerning job numbers, and a deep-rooted sense of anger and nihilism that dominates our politics. If that trend continues, not only will we fail the next generation of men and boys, but we'll drag everyone else down with us. We have a duty to rebuild a model of masculinity rooted in integrity instead of ego, competence instead of dominance, in wisdom instead of reaction, masculinity that can bear responsibility without crumbling into resentment, masculinity that knows how to build, protect, mentor, and grow, masculinity that gives men a reason to endure the difficulty of life and help lay the foundation for what our shared future should look like. Most importantly, we need to build a model for masculinity that is rooted in an unshakable love for life, because this is what will push you through the hardest moments. It's what will prevent you from checking out when things really go off the rails. It's what feeds that sometimes very quiet inner voice that says, you might not feel okay now, and it might not be okay for a while. But eventually, something will break, and you will be okay. The men of our generation have an important job, and we have a lot of work to do. So let's make sure it's done right. Thanks for listening. I hope you got something out of this, and if you did, I hope you'll take a moment to share it with a brother or a friend or just somebody who you think might get something out of it too. After all, we're all in this together.